Welcome back to our podcast, Fossil versus Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about what about fashion? We buy a lot of clothes. The fashion industry is worth around $1.7 trillion, and over 300 million people work across its global supply chains. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, in just 15 years, clothing production has doubled. But the way we use our clothing has changed dramatically too. On average, a garment is worn just 7 times before being discarded. And shockingly, every second, the equivalent of a rubbish lorry of clothes is burnt or buried in landfill. Our obsession with fast fashion, cheaply made, quickly sold, and rapidly discarded clothing, is having a huge environmental impact. It is challenging to find exact figures, but it's estimated that fashion accounts for around 8 to 10% of global carbon emissions. If correct, that's more than international flights and maritime shipping combined. The fashion industry is the second biggest consumer of water. Producing a single cotton shirt requires 2,700 litres of water, enough for one person to drink for 2.5 years. And around 60% of all materials used by the fashion industry are plastic-based, and hence derived from fossil fuels. When we wash these garments, it releases microfibers that enter the oceans and pollute marine ecosystems. But the impact isn't just environmental, it's social too. Our demand for new, cheap clothing puts immense pressure on supply chains, often at the expense of human welfare. Garment workers, primarily women, in Bangladesh, for example, earn as little as $96 per month. We need to rethink the way we produce, consume, and value what we wear.
As ever, Daisy, those are pretty staggering numbers, aren't they?
Scary.
Yeah. And it is quite hard to make these connections in the ordinary everyday life between, the purchasing of a garment and the supply chain on the one hand and what happens afterwards. But they are pretty staggering. And the percentage of the climate change problem, I think, would surprise many people. I mean, just for example, the difference between flights and fashion.
Yeah, we hear so much about flights,
we
and flights is only around 2%,
yeah.
I think. But it is true that when I was trying to find that number, there are lots of different estimates because these are such huge, often opaque supply chains, and companies don't really publish the data on how much they're producing, how many suppliers they are, where these suppliers are. Perhaps they don't even know. And so getting figures on what the emissions are for these companies, for the industry, is quite challenging. And what is the scope of the fashion industry? Sometimes the numbers include fashion and textiles. Sometimes it's just fashion. But still, it's however you cut it, it's a huge percentage.
So it may not be easy to be precise, or one should be skeptical about the data, but order of magnitude, rough approximation tells a realistic story about the nature of the problem and hopefully what we might do about it. But we think anyway, and we can't really represent an entire generation, but we think there's some interesting conflicts and paradoxes involved
100%.
with the generational differences, the behavioural differences between generations in their attitude to clothes and the way in which clothes are bought, consumed, and discarded, right?
Definitely. There's a really interesting generational aspect here, I think, in terms of young people and their the way they approach clothing, because young people are mindful of sustainability and they do understand the impacts of the fashion industry on the environment. But at the same time, they're under this pressure from social media influences to change fashion, change what they're wearing constantly. And social media thrives on novelty and wearing something new. And so I think I saw that a third of Gen Z feel they are obsessed with fast fashion. And while it's 64% of 16 to 19-year-olds in the UK admit to buying clothes they've never worn, only 44% of all adults say that they've never worn. So there's a big gap between the younger generation and the overall population there.
This idea of buying something and only wearing it a few times.
On average, 7 times.
Before actually discarding. Everybody knows people who buy and kind of store or just, keep somehow, maybe for later, but the idea that there's this rapid turnover of purchasing and then discarding, plus, I suppose, online purchasing itself. Certainly, if you're buying online, trying at home, and then sending it back, these are all cycles of energy use and transportation and packaging and Lord knows what else in a consumption choice, a pattern of behavior, which, let's face it, is new. I mean, is generationally new. That wasn't possible, wasn't part of the way people bought clothes in the past. But it also reveals a different approach to the goods themselves, the items, the things themselves. The idea that it's to be worn and then discarded, as opposed to owned with some sort of respect for how it was made and kept for a period of time because it has value as an item that was chosen carefully, that it performs a function that lasts a long time, and it can actually be, loved for many years and repaired if necessary. I mean, we should talk about that too. These are very different attitudes to the consumption, which have a knock-on effect to the production and the waste.
These clothing items are just so cheap. And I think that's the main aspect, that young people care about sustainability, but do they care about it enough to pay extra for an item that's going to last longer and that they're going to treasure? Probably
It's interesting. I mean, apparently not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not perfect here. I do, go to Zara. I do buy good bargains. Maybe not as much as average, but I think everyone does it.
Yeah. I don't. I mean, I absolutely love clothes, as you know, and I have a huge respect for the makers of clothes,
Yeah.
The craft involved. I am drawn to people who are in the clothing, tailoring business. I have a huge respect for people who can make, including, my own wife, knitting clothes. I think that's a fantastic skill, and the items have extra value. Now, there's a certain romanticism about that, and there's a certain acceptance that it's possible for me to purchase things that might have higher upfront cost, but which I will keep for decades. I literally don't buy and throw away anything like that. And I'm also interested in the idea that you could invest in something, an item of clothing that you intend to wear for decades. That's a very different state of mind to fast fashion. I probably don't go in the direction, the idea that you could perhaps have a kind of uniform, a kind of selection of everyday items that you wear constantly, and that helps you. I'm not going down that track, right? Although I do know that is another way of approaching the quality of items, that you choose a few items that you purchase and keep and you wear repeatedly. I'm always thinking about what I'm going to wear tomorrow, and I love that. I love the whole experience of the creativity involved in dressing for the day. And so I take care. I think about it the night before. I lay clothes out. I don't know whether other people do this too, and I enjoy that whole experience of putting together an outfit. And I know my clothes well because I've had them quite a long time. It's not like I don't buy new. I do. But I'm really interested in that difference of approach to the ownership of clothes, the celebration, if you like, of the clothing. I mean, the person I was thinking of with this limited, repeatable wardrobe is Patrick Grant, who you may know. He has a tailoring business and clothing business, but also does the sewing bee program. And he's a very attractive figure in every sense. And he's written this book, Less, I think it's called, which is all about choosing quality items of clothing that you know you're going to use and wear over a long period of time. And he's very conscious of the waste in the industry. He knows the industry well. He's also very conscious of the value of producing materials as close to where they're used rather than moved. And that produces some paradoxes too, because you know that the clothing trade, as well as the textile trade, is a global business. And in many respects, a vital one for the economies of those countries that are doing the exporting. But equally, there's a tremendous amount of waste in the movement of items around the planet. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, the price of carbon is really not being paid at all, or if it is, it's very marginal. So it's the low price for the item that's come from China is partly low because of the wages, and partly because it's not paying any price for the pollution involved with either making or shipping or disposing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's the regulatory system, the economic models, the financial models. None of them are picking up the true cost.
Definitely. I think it is this problem of I don't have a huge wardrobe. I feel like sometimes I get bored of my clothes. Do you ever feel that if you have the same clothes for 10, 20 years, you look at them and you get a bit bored and you want something new?
I couldn't do Patrick Grant, even though I hugely respect. And I think the Patrick Grant approach is a good one for many. But I like the variety.
Mm-hmm.
However, I will keep clothes that kind of, if you like, go out of fashion, then come back in. If they're made of decent material and you've looked after them, then it might be 10 years later and suddenly, actually, that looks quite good now. And obviously fashions change. And by the way, I'm not against the idea of fashion at all. I think that's creative. It produces, a kind of art form in clothes. It's exciting, exhilarating, but obviously it's manipulated as well. And once fashion is attached to the business model and the idea of extracting more out of the consumer, then some of the art gets downplayed in favor of the commerce. And so I don't want to be negative about the beauty that's associated with fashion, but very mindful of the wastage and the manipulation and sometimes the absurdity of it. The kind of constantly creating the new can accelerate and increase the wastage and the kind of disposability of the items. I've never worked in the industry. I've had occasional advisory roles around the edge, and it's a very complex business. There are many elements to it. It's quite hard to manage, as you said, the supply chains. And it's important that the industry does its best to fix itself. And there are, as we know, industry initiatives that are doing that. Fashion Pact is one, and there are several. And there are specialist investment vehicles now to invest in the sustainability of supply chains and alternative materials. At Imperial College, the Undaunted program there has already produced some quite interesting startups that are looking at alternatives to, it might be to dyes, for example. There's a business that's come through I like the look of. I don't know whether they'll make it commercially, but looking at the environmental damage associated with certain dyes and trying to replace them with ones that are less environmentally harmful. There's lots of work being done on fibers. Some of the more established fibers, like wool, for example, are trying to promote themselves as against fossil fuel-based materials. On the other hand, as we've discussed, sometimes if you can make a material that can be used many, many times and keep its shape and maybe use less water and washing or various. There are loads of elements to this.
There's a lot of innovation.
There's a lot of innovation that's making us a marginal difference around the edge. But boy, if you're looking for a sector to grapple with, and do something useful about climate change, which might be fascinating and offer other attractive values, it's an interesting sector to focus on, isn't it?
Definitely. I think the production innovation is really exciting and really cool. Some of the things that are being done, like leather made from mushrooms and things like that. But I think for me, it's the consumption side that is really needs to be addressed. How do we, because these business models are relying on selling lots and lots of clothes, and we need to buy less clothes. I don't think we're going to solve this problem, even if we ended up having a circular system. I don't know. I just think we need to buy less.
So less is actually
and that is just
the
at
theme.
odds
Yeah.
with so many of these business models. I was reading about Shein, which is the big name now they don't even call it fast fashion anymore. It's ultra fast fashion, because these companies are relying on artificial intelligence to monitor consumer preferences in real time. And so their factories are looking at these screens that are telling them what is the consumer buying now, and they're adjusting their production, which may have savings in terms of waste at factories. They're not producing
overproducing stock
that are
perhaps.
not popular.
Yeah.
But it's just amazing how AI is becoming part of this as well. And the stat that I've kept quoting to friends this week, which I thought was amazing, is Shein add 10,000 items to their website every day.
Oh, my word. That is
they
so
have
different.
600,000 items for sale at any one time, and the average price of an item is £7.90.
Wow.
I mean, how can you sell so cheaply without, as you say, there's so many hidden costs there. And again, going back to what you were saying, the speed that these items get from design to shop or to store is, I think, 10, 15 days. It's such a small amount of time, and so much of that is related to air shipping.
Yeah.
They even send individual products wrapped with the customer's name on it on a plane from China to America, for example. So, yeah.
So it's interesting, isn't it? And one always try in these conversations, knowing myself that's excited by new. You know, I like the new. I'm excited by innovation. The first time something is done, or something that could be legitimately described as progress is always attractive.
Okay.
And yet, I also know that progress is not a kind of constant linear thing. You know, obviously not. There are things that go backwards. There are loops and eddies and cycles, and our lives are not linear. Our societies don't progress in a perfectly step-by-step way. And so I feel like I want to celebrate the brilliance of that new system, and yet it absolutely shocks me. I feel revulsion too. And I have huge respect for example, someone who can hand stitch a suit. You know, that to my mind is
such skill.
Huge skill, great craft, produce something, an individualized item that will last decades. And that's just a completely different universe to the story you just described of Shine. And yet I'm also aware that to pay for that craft skill now is the reserve of very few. And that creates a sort of uncomfortable feeling. So I very much would encourage anybody who could afford to get a suit made for them, or a jacket or some other item that would last a long time. But the barrier to entry is enormous.
Yeah, I've started trying to use tailors more. So if something breaks, if an item of clothing breaks, try taking it to the tailor rather than buying a new one. But the other day, a pocket had broken on my Zara jeans, which cost me £15, I think. And just to fix the pocket at the tailor cost me 20.
Yeah, I know. I do the same. I do the same with jumpers and things. There's there's a sewing shop on the Munster Road. I take things, I get repaired, or elbow goes in a jacket that I like, an old tweed jacket that's been around for a while. I go and get it repaired, and but it does cost money, and I probably couldn't buy a jacket for the price but I know what you mean. The trade-offs are difficult to explain and justify in pure monetary terms, which tells you there's something wrong in our system of valuing. In my view, anyway. Maybe there's a counter one that says, "Don't worry, James. It's just fine. The economics will take over." But I feel uncomfortable with it. It seems to me that things have gone wrong when the purchasing and the maintenance of an item of clothing for years is not valued, and the purchasing and discarding of one is rewarded with a lower price.
Yeah, I think for it to really be fast fashion, it is that discarding rapidly part that's important. I mean, if you do buy those £15 Zara jeans and you wear them for 10 years, maybe that's not a fast fashion item anymore.
So maybe is the end to look at mostly is
that
what
whole
you
process.
do. And well, you and I know where a lot of these clothes finish up too. If they're not in a landfill or burned, they're in a container going to Accra. Right? And that produces some real dilemmas too. Mm-hmm. So that you have this bizarre situation where you might have to take a cotton exporting country that's sending their raw material off to be manufactured somewhere else, and the big loop comes round, and in the marketplace, the discarded clothes, probably via a charity in another
those
country.
Big charity bins that you see on the street. Yeah.
And they've come in a big loop, and then what happens? They're in that marketplace, and they are depressing the price that could be afforded to a domestic producer, so that the exporting country is exporting the raw material, not making the items themselves, and finishing up with a discarded item in their market, which is cheap, but not providing the kind of price that a domestic manufacturer could use to build a domestic market for themselves. It's a hard thing there's all sorts of things that are just wrong about that system. Very difficult to fix.
Very complicated.
Very difficult to fix. Same with many commodities, of course, not just cotton, but, in many respects, the basic materials of cloth and the design and the way that cloth represents something about your culture, you want celebrated, you want rewarded. It's not that you can't get beautiful kente cloth in Ghana that is very much made for the place. You can, but that marketplace scene is familiar, and piles and piles of thrown away items. It might be marginally better than a landfill, but it's still got to get there.
And I'm sure it doesn't all. Sure it doesn't all get sold in those markets.
It'll also find its way into a landfill there too. Yeah, because they won't all get used. But yeah, strange. I find that strange, and I'd love to see more domestic production of things of value in their place with their designs. I think the fashion industry is a really good place to have a look at how you might reorient supply chains and change the direction of some of the flows. I'd like to see more, if you like, south-south trade, more designs made in West Africa that get sold in east or north or south, or connections made the other way, so the value added is in Accra, and the purchasing, it might be in Milan, but it's not necessarily all the value is not moved to the Italian house. That's something I think would be good, but I would imagine that for that couldn't really. I don't know the economics of it, but I doubt whether that's a fast fashion option. I think that's got to be probably more of a premier brand. You'd have to build a brand in West Africa that would be attractive to the consumer in the Western markets as well as in the local markets. That's really difficult to get right, the costing.
Yeah, the social impacts probably get forgotten almost more than the environmental, I think, because there's so much conversation now about circular economy and the environmental impacts of closing the loop and the economic impacts of how we decouple growth and environmental harm. But then where's the social element in that in terms of the social value added, the social progression?
Yeah.
I think that's part of the conversation that we need to.
Yeah. I sense that we'll probably get more and more examples of design value having a sort of cultural presence in the countries that have traditionally exported raw materials or simply supplied labor. More signs of that. And not just I happen to be thinking of West Africa as I started down that route. But I think that's really important that the look of the clothing, the situation of the making of the clothing, the more that can resonate in a culture that isn't dominated by us, the better I think the sustainability will be. There will be more of a chance to produce for a place in a way that can be valued properly. But I don't know.
It's very personal fashion.
It is, yeah, it is. And also, what good examples have we got? I mean, in the rapidly developing nations of the last decades, including, of course, China, it's not that there isn't a huge domestic market, but the China example is really an export market, isn't it?
I think so.
It hasn't fundamentally altered, and they're making clothes, quote unquote, for us. The patterns, the styles. I don't know whether you feel. You could tell. I feel like there needs to be some kind of switch. What is clothing? What does it look like? How long is it kept?
Well, I think the poster child example is Patagonia, isn't it? In the fashion industry, I think, and their products are, again, expensive, but they really are designed to last a lifetime. And if they don't, they have systems where you can return the item, not return the item, return it to be repaired and restored. They use recycled materials in their products. They've even had marketing campaigns discouraging consumption. Do you remember their "Don't Buy This Jacket" campaign they did, and how they are refusing to call themselves a sustainable company because they don't believe that even with all the efforts they're making that they can make that claim, as they're still contributing in some way to this consumption, overconsumption
the water
issue.
Numbers are staggering, aren't they?
Yeah.
My great friend Mina Gooley, who's been a water campaigner for years, she's always been on this, the amount of water in, as you say, in the making of a pair of jeans. But there are that pressure on the water resource, the conflict over water, exacerbated by climate change. Arguably, the place where conflict is most likely is where water is scarce and something has happened in either the patterns of precipitation or that there's been years of drought or something that climate change has amplified that increases pressure on water supplies, and the choices that are made as what water is used for clearly has an effect on the industry. But there's also a factor in the consumption. We do need to learn how much water is involved in the fashion industry. And it isn't widely understood, is it? I mean, it hasn't really registered in people's minds. It's not a factor when you make
Cotton
a purchase.
uses huge amounts of water and has caused all kinds of issues in, I did a project on it during university, the Aral Sea, is it?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one, yeah. That's extraordinary. That story of collective farming, absurd 5-year plans driven from Moscow, weird bureaucratic corruption, false reporting, and the idea that you could continue to exploit the water for the crop without consequence, and then the consequence emerged, and it was so visible, the shrinking of a sea, and all those pictures, which I really do commend. I mean, well done for bringing it up, because if you wanted a visual representation of the consequences of a certain type of government, a certain type of production, a certain type of stupidity, it's a good one.
Yeah.
There are all those pictures that you can find quite easily of
the social consequences, the health consequences of
desperate,
just having no water left because it's all just been taken by the cotton farming.
And once things start to, move away from your ability to manage, because you've passed thresholds, tipping points, of course, which we talk about a lot and sometimes find hard to visualize or imagine until you see one like that. Yeah. Wow. I remember years ago, it's a long time ago now, I remember I was part of a small independent advisory group to our then Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, and he asked me to present to him 3 priorities for the foreign policy of the UK in respect to the environment. And I could have just said climate change, climate change, climate change. I sort of did. But I said climate change and the fact that we don't have robust international institutions to deal with global environmental problems. But the third item was water. And this is a very long time ago. And his first reaction was, but that's really a domestic issue, right? As opposed to a foreign policy issue. So I said, well, imagine a map of the world, start in North Africa, Southern Mediterranean, work through the Levant, go up into Iraq, Iran, all the way down the Gulf, into the Stans, into southern Mongolia and southern China, cross the Pacific into the borderlands between Mexico and Southern America, and ask yourself, are any of those places self-sufficient in water? And is there potential for conflict? Right? Now tell me it's not a foreign policy issue. And yet it was incredibly difficult to make it a proper. We talked about it before, a minor, not very well observed desertification convention never really picked up any kind of political strength. The climate change agreements only peripherally addressed water, implicitly addressed water, but never really focused on it. 1 or 2 attempts in the trading regime to think about water, because once you do think about water and trade, you realize that all those places that are not self-sufficient in water are dependent upon trade, right? They have to effectively import their water via products. Somebody else has got water, they produce the thing that is needed or purchased, and it gets traded. So open trading systems are one way you manage water scarcity and water conflict as a result. But obviously we now know it's very visible. It also affects migration. And so these are big connected forces, but we really haven't put nearly enough focus on water itself, on how you better manage it, how you better distribute it, how you better create the reserves, the buffer zones, the watershed protection, where you've got the places where effectively our water is made. Sporadic attempts to do that over the years, watershed management and basin management, things like that, but they're not elevated to the status of importance that they should do, given it's essential to all life.
And there are, as always, trade-offs, because organic cotton, for example, it uses less pesticides. Obviously, that's really important. But at the same time, organic products tend to have lower yields because they're using fewer pesticides, fewer fertilizers. And so if you've got lower yields and you're still wanting to produce the same amount, you need more land, more water. So again, I think it goes back to we need less. We can't produce the same.
Can't really have a serious
same amounts.
Story to tell about sustainability that doesn't involve less. Is that the message?
I think so. The way that Patagonia put it is buy less, demand more.
That's quite a good phrase. It also helps with some of the equity discussions, the kind of fairness discussions. Whenever you get stuck in international negotiations between blocs, crudely north-south, although I long for the day where we don't have to use that language. And it is fundamentally changed now from when I first started. Those blocs are very different now. But, whenever you push too hard at a global agreement to reduce emissions, the response is, well, hang on a minute, have a look at your consumption. You're driving up demand. Look at the way you consume. Look at the amount you consume. You sort your consumption problem out before you tell us what to do with our development plans. And they were always pretty sharp exchanges and did require a reaction to think, we need to pay attention to that obvious imbalance and just the sheer amount of things. But we all know also there's aspiration attached to those things, a real drive to have what the other has already. And each step in that progression, for want of a better word, involves the use of vital resources, including water.
Production and consumption-based emissions are really interesting because the way that we tend to talk about emissions are production-based. So what are the emissions actually being generated in your country or where you are? But actually, if we measure it as consumption-based emissions, so what are the emissions being generated as a result of what your country is consuming, it tells a very different story. The UK graphs of production versus consumption-based emissions are really interesting. We often sort of shout about how much we've reduced our emissions in the past 20 years or whatever, but so much of that is because we've offshored those emissions to other countries. So it looks like a nice story with our production-based emissions because we're not producing steel or our clothes or a lot of we don't do much manufacturing as a country, but our consumption is driving that manufacturing elsewhere, and we're not accountable for those emissions elsewhere. So it's
not on a nation-state basis.
No,
so
not on an NDC basis.
We've got good evidence that you can have growth and reduced emissions. We have evidence everywhere that you can do that. But you can't look at a single country in isolation. You've got to look at their trading relationships, and you've got to look at the connection between production and consumption. And as you said at the beginning, Daisy, that the industry is huge, right? And it's a global industry. Mm-hmm. So it might be one of the best examples of the connection between production and consumption in confronting climate change. The fashion industry, the clothing industry, the apparel industry, to use several different words for what we're talking about, is a very good example of why you absolutely have to have some kind of cooperation in the sense of agreement internationally as to what to do about the problem. But you also need to track the flows of resources. Where is the money, material, goods, where are they going if you want to intervene in that system to make it more efficient, more sustainable, better? And then there are all the behavioral aspects that we've talked about too, different ways of valuing the items themselves, the things that are recognized as, I don't know, all the things that we crave, the sort of what looks cool, what is attractive, what is the way one wants to be seen, because they're all outward displays, aren't they? Our clothes, they represent us. So
definitely,
those are all cultural, philosophical matters that need some rethinking, I think.
Agreed. Thank you for listening to Fossil versus Future. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and we hope that you will connect with us on LinkedIn and send us your questions. What are the questions that your generation is asking about climate? We look forward to hearing your thoughts and your feedback.
And make sure you subscribe and stay updated.